The morning of September 23, 1942, Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov stood beside his BM-13 Katyusha launcher, watching German panzer divisions advance across the wheat fields outside Stalingrad. The acrid smell of diesel exhaust mixed with a metallic taste of fear in his mouth as he counted the approaching tanks. 47 Tiger and Panzer IV tanks, rolling in perfect formation, their commanders confident that no Soviet artillery could match their coordinated assault. The radio crackled with retreat orders from divisional command. Fall back to secondary positions. Preserve the rocket launchers. Do not engage superior forces. Volkov's hand trembled as he reached for the firing controls, knowing that obeying those orders meant watching his infantry comrades get slaughtered in their foxholes 300 meters ahead. His breath came in short bursts, heart hammering against his ribs as he made a choice that would violate every tactical manual in the Red Army. He was about to turn 16 rockets into a symphony of destruction that would haunt German tank crews for the remainder of the war. No one in the 13th Guards Rocket Artillery Regiment knew that one man's calculated disobedience that morning would transform the Katyusha from a support weapon into the most psychologically devastating force on the Eastern Front. Dmitry Volkov grew up in the small village of Kostroma, northeast of Moscow, where his father operated a blacksmith shop and his mother taught mathematics at the local school. Born in 1918, he spent his childhood among the rhythmic hammering of his father's anvil and the precise calculations his mother scrawled across wooden boards for her students. The combination of mechanical intuition and mathematical precision would prove invaluable when he volunteered for artillery service in 1939. Unlike the sons of party officials who entered military academies, Volkov enlisted as a common soldier, earning his way through gunnery school by demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to calculate trajectory angles in his head. His instructors noted his tendency to question standard firing tables, always asking why certain angles produced optimal results and whether alternative approaches might prove more effective. During training exercises near Tula, he consistently outperformed cadets from more privileged backgrounds, hitting targets that others missed by margins that seemed impossible for equipment manufactured in Soviet factories. His fellow trainees nicknamed him Calculator, partly for his mathematical skills and partly for his methodical approach to every problem. But beneath his quiet exterior burned an intensity that worried some officers and impressed others. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Volkov was assigned to the newly formed rocket artillery units, experimenting with a weapon system that most commanders viewed with skepticism. The BM-13 Katyusha launcher, mounted on the back of a Studebaker truck, could fire 16 rockets in rapid succession, but accuracy remained questionable, and reload times stretched dangerously long. Most artillery officers preferred traditional cannons with predictable ballistics and proven effectiveness. Volkov, however, saw potential that others missed. He spent countless hours studying the rocket's flight characteristics, timing wind patterns, and calculating how terrain features affected projectile paths. His commanding officer, Major Gorsky, initially dismissed these efforts as the obsessions of an overeager junior lieutenant. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between his regiment and complete annihilation. The Eastern Front in 1942 represented the largest military conflict in human history, with over 4 million German, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops advancing across a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, was driving toward the industrial city of Stalingrad, with the goal of cutting Soviet supply lines along the Volga River and securing access to Caucasus oil fields. The German offensive, codenamed Operation Blue, had achieved stunning initial successes, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners and advancing hundreds of miles in just weeks. By September 1942, German forces had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, where they encountered increasingly desperate Soviet resistance. The Red Army's traditional artillery had proven inadequate against German combined arms tactics, which coordinated tanks, aircraft, and infantry in devastating attacks that shattered Soviet defensive lines. Soviet commanders faced impossible choices: retreat and surrender vital industrial areas, or stand and fight with inferior equipment against better-trained and better-equipped German forces. The newly introduced Katyusha rocket system represented an experimental solution to this crisis. But most field commanders remained skeptical of its effectiveness. Unlike traditional artillery, which fired single shells with predictable accuracy, the Katyusha launched multiple rockets in rapid succession, creating area bombardments that could devastate large sections of terrain. However, the system's lack of precision made it unsuitable for close support operations, and its distinctive launch signature made it an immediate target for counter-battery fire. Official doctrine mandated that Katyusha units operate from concealed positions far behind the front lines, launching coordinated barrages against enemy rear areas before quickly relocating to avoid retaliation. The mathematics were stark. German forces outnumbered defending Soviet units by margins of 3-1 in most sectors, with superior air support and better communication systems providing additional advantages. Throughout early September, Volkov's regiment had followed standard operating procedures, launching rockets from positions 8 to 10 kilometers behind the front lines and achieving mixed results. The rockets created spectacular explosions and impressive craters, but their psychological impact remained limited because German troops rarely witnessed the launches directly. Intelligence reports indicated that German soldiers had begun to adapt to Katyusha bombardments, taking cover during attacks and resuming operations once the explosions subsided. Major Gorsky received increasingly urgent orders from divisional headquarters to maximize the psychological effect of rocket attacks, but conventional tactics seemed insufficient for the task. During a briefing on September 20th, Gorsky explained the situation to his battery commanders with characteristic bluntness. German tank crews had grown confident in their ability to weather Soviet artillery attacks, knowing that most bombardments lasted only minutes and caused relatively few casualties among armored vehicles. The Katyusha's greatest strength, its ability to deliver massive firepower in seconds, was also its greatest weakness in prolonged engagements. Once the initial barrage ended, German forces could resume their attacks with minimal delay. Volkov listened to these discussions with growing frustration, convinced that they were using the weapon system incorrectly. Traditional artillery doctrine emphasized precision and conservation of ammunition, but the Katyusha represented a fundamentally different approach to battlefield support. Its true power lay not in its accuracy, but in its ability to create sudden, overwhelming terror that could break enemy morale and disrupt carefully coordinated attacks. During target practice sessions, he had noticed how the sound of multiple rockets launching simultaneously created a distinctive shrieking noise that seemed to penetrate deeply into human consciousness. Local farmers had described the sound as resembling the wail of banshees or the screaming of demons, and even Soviet troops found the noise deeply unsettling. But current tactics minimized this psychological effect by positioning launchers too far from enemy lines for the sound to achieve maximum impact. Volkov began to formulate a dangerous theory. What if Katyusha units moved closer to the front lines and launched their rockets in direct sight of advancing enemy forces? The psychological shock might prove more valuable than the physical damage, potentially causing entire enemy units to lose cohesion at critical moments. He kept these thoughts to himself, knowing that proposing such tactics would be viewed as reckless insubordination. His comrades, Sergeant Alexei Petrov and Corporal Viktor Kozlov, shared his frustrations but lacked his mathematical confidence to envision alternative approaches. Petrov, a veteran of the Finnish War, understood artillery tactics, but respected established doctrine. Kozlov, barely 20 years old and eager to prove himself, followed orders without question, but privately wondered why their expensive rocket launcher seemed to achieve so little compared to traditional cannons. And then the morning of September 23rd arrived, bringing with it a crisis that would test every assumption about proper artillery employment. The German attack began at dawn with a preliminary bombardment from 88-millimeter guns positioned on the opposite ridge. Shells screamed overhead and exploded among the Soviet positions with methodical precision, each impact designed to suppress defensive fire and clear paths for advancing armor. Through his binoculars, Volkov watched German tank commanders coordinating their assault with professional competence, their vehicles moving in textbook formation while maintaining communication through radio sets that Soviet forces could only envy. 47 tanks represented more armored strength than his entire division possessed, and they were advancing toward positions held by fewer than 200 Soviet infantry, armed primarily with rifles and grenades. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Without effective artillery support, the defensive line would collapse within minutes of contact. Major Gorsky's voice crackled through the radio, ordering all rocket units to withdraw to secondary positions 12 kilometers to the rear. Standard doctrine demanded preserving artillery assets over supporting forward infantry, a policy that made sense from a strategic perspective, but felt like abandonment to soldiers watching their comrades prepare for hopeless battles. Volkov acknowledged the order while calculating distances and angles in his head. The retreating route would take 30 minutes to traverse, by which time the German tanks would have overrun the Soviet positions and established control over the entire sector. His infantry comrades would be dead or captured, and the enemy would gain access to supply routes that could affect the entire Stalingrad defense. Sergeant Petrov stood beside the truck, waiting for orders to begin the withdrawal. Corporal Kozlov had already started the engine, his face reflecting the grim resignation that had become common among Soviet soldiers facing impossible odds. The radio continued to broadcast retreat orders with increasing urgency, but Volkov found himself studying the advancing German formation instead of preparing to obey. The enemy tanks were maintaining perfect intervals, their commanders confident that no effective resistance awaited them. They had no reason to expect rocket fire from such close range, no experience with the psychological impact of 16 rockets launching simultaneously from a position where every German soldier could see and hear the attack. Traditional artillery doctrine existed for good reasons, but perhaps some situations demanded unconventional responses. The sound of tank engines grew louder as the German formation approached optimal range for his weapons. Volkov's hand moved toward the firing controls while his mind raced through trajectory calculations. Range, 800 meters. Wind, negligible. Target concentration, maximum. Psychological impact, unknown but potentially decisive. The mathematics suggested success, but success would require violating direct orders from a superior officer. He thought of his father's anvil, how the blacksmith had taught him that sometimes the hardest steel required the hottest fire. His mother's mathematics lessons echoed in his memory, emphasizing that correct calculations meant nothing without the courage to act on their conclusions. Sergeant Petrov noticed his hesitation and asked quietly whether they should begin the withdrawal. Volkov looked at his men, then at the advancing German tanks, then at the radio broadcasting increasingly frantic retreat orders. The moment of decision had arrived, and he understood that his choice would either save the defensive line or destroy his military career. He had been following orders for 3 years of war, watching superior German tactics defeat Soviet courage again and again. Perhaps it was time to discover what happened when Soviet innovation met German expectations. He reached for the firing controls with steady hands, knowing that the next 30 seconds would change everything his men believed about warfare and everything the Germans believed about Soviet capabilities. The morning was about to become much more interesting. Volkov's voice cut through the radio static with deliberate calm as he announced his intentions to the battery crew. "We are engaging targets at close range. Prepare for immediate displacement after firing." His words carried the authority of absolute conviction, and his men responded with the automatic obedience that months of combat had drilled into their reflexes. Sergeant Petrov's eyes widened as he realized the implications, but he moved to his position without protest. Corporal Kozlov gunned the truck engine to maximum readiness, understanding that their survival would depend on rapid movement after the attack. The German tanks had closed to 700 meters, their commanders still confident in their tactical superiority and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Through his scope, Volkov could see individual tank commanders standing in their turrets, directing the advance with casual professionalism that suggested they expected minimal resistance. The lead Panzer IV bore the markings of an experienced crew, its commander wearing the black uniform of a veteran tanker who had probably fought in Poland, France, and the early stages of the Russian campaign. These were not inexperienced troops who might panic under fire, but hardened soldiers who had learned to trust their equipment and their training. But they had never experienced a Katyusha barrage launched from positions where they could see every rocket leaving its launcher. Volkov began his firing sequence with the methodical precision his instructors had drilled into him years earlier. Elevation, 12 degrees. Azimuth, 240 degrees. Range, 700 meters, and closing. The first rocket ignited with a brilliant flash that could be seen across the entire battlefield, followed immediately by the distinctive shrieking sound that gave the weapon its nickname. Stalin's organ began to play its deadly melody as 15 more rockets followed in rapid succession, each projectile trailing fire and smoke as it arced toward the German formation. The sound built to a crescendo that seemed to tear the air itself, a wailing shriek that penetrated armor plating and human flesh with equal ease. German tank commanders who had faced artillery bombardments throughout 2 years of war found themselves confronted with something entirely outside their experience. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. Tank commanders who had been standing confidently in their turrets suddenly disappeared inside their vehicles, slamming hatches, as if thin steel could protect them from the approaching nightmare. Radio communications that had maintained perfect discipline throughout the advance dissolved into panicked shouting as crews tried to understand what was happening to them. The rockets impacted across the German formation with mathematical precision, each explosion occurring exactly where Volkov's calculations had predicted. 3 tanks disappeared in direct hits, their ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions that sent turrets spinning through the air like children's toys. 4 more vehicles suffered mobility kills, their tracks torn away by blast fragments that left them stranded and vulnerable. But the physical damage, impressive as it was, paled in comparison to the psychological destruction that spread through the surviving German crews like a plague. Trained soldiers who had conquered half of Europe found themselves paralyzed by terror that seemed to bypass rational thought and strike directly at primal human fears. The distinctive sound of the Katyusha launch had imprinted itself on their consciousness with traumatic intensity, creating associations between that shrieking wail and immediate overwhelming danger. Tank commanders who had maintained perfect formation discipline throughout countless battles suddenly found their vehicles scattered across the battlefield as drivers instinctively sought any available cover. The coordinated attack that had begun with such professional confidence had disintegrated into chaos within seconds of the first rocket impact. Sergeant Petrov watched the destruction with amazement that bordered on religious awe, He had seen traditional artillery bombardments cause physical damage, but never had he witnessed an attack that seemed to break the enemy's will to fight. German infantry, who had been advancing alongside the tanks, were now lying prone in whatever cover they could find, their attack momentum completely destroyed by the psychological shock of the Katyusha barrage. Corporal Kozlov gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, ready to execute the rapid withdrawal that would be essential for their survival, but mesmerized by the spectacle of German tactical superiority dissolving under the impact of 16 Soviet rockets. The immediate aftermath revealed the true genius of Volkov's tactical innovation. German counter-battery fire, which should have begun within minutes of the attack, remained scattered and ineffective because enemy forward observers had lost their carefully plotted positions. The coordinated advance that had threatened to break through Soviet defenses had become a disorganized retreat, as tank commanders struggled to re-establish communication and control over their scattered units. But more importantly, word of the attack spread through German communication networks with the speed of wildfire, carrying with it detailed descriptions of the terrifying sound and devastating effect of close-range Katyusha fire. Within hours, German troops throughout the Stalingrad sector were receiving warnings about a new Soviet tactic that seemed designed specifically to exploit their psychological vulnerabilities. The mathematical precision of Volkov's attack had created psychological impact that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Intelligence reports intercepted by Soviet signals units revealed that German commanders were beginning to alter their attack patterns to account for the possibility of close-range rocket fire, reducing the effectiveness of tactics that had previously proven successful. The ripple effects of one unauthorized engagement were transforming German tactical assumptions across hundreds of kilometers of front line. Major Gorsky arrived at Volkov's position 3 hours after the attack, expecting to find his subordinate preparing for court-martial proceedings. Instead, he discovered a battery crew calmly preparing for their next engagement, while German tanks burned on the horizon. The major's anger at Volkov's disobedience warred with his amazement at the tactical results, creating a cognitive dissonance that reflected the broader confusion within Soviet command structures. Traditional military doctrine emphasized obedience and coordination, but the evidence before his eyes suggested that individual initiative might sometimes achieve better results than centralized control. Volkov's quiet explanation of his tactical reasoning impressed Gorsky despite himself. The lieutenant had not acted from reckless bravado or emotional impulse, but from careful analysis of the weapon system's capabilities and the specific tactical situation. His mathematical calculations had proven accurate, and his psychological insights had revealed vulnerabilities that no one had previously recognized. The burned German tanks provided irrefutable evidence that unconventional tactics could succeed when applied with precision and timing. More importantly, the psychological impact on German forces suggested that the Katyusha could become a weapon of terror as well as destruction, multiplying its effectiveness through fear rather than just explosive power. That evening, Divisional Headquarters received a detailed report describing the engagement and its results. The report carefully avoided mentioning Volkov's violation of retreat orders, instead emphasizing the tactical innovations that had made the attack successful. Within days, similar tactics were being tested by other rocket artillery units along the front, each crew adapting Volkov's insights to their specific situations. The unauthorized engagement that should have resulted in disciplinary action instead became the foundation for new tactical doctrine that would be studied and refined throughout the remainder of the war. But the most significant impact occurred among the German forces who had witnessed or heard about the attack. The terror spread through German ranks with viral intensity, carried by survivors who had experienced the psychological trauma of close-range Katyusha fire. Tank crews who had never encountered the weapon began to develop anticipatory anxiety, their effectiveness degraded by constant fear of an attack that might never come. The distinctive sound of the rocket launch, once heard, could never be forgotten, and German soldiers throughout the Eastern Front found themselves listening for that particular shrieking wail whenever Soviet artillery opened fire. Psychological warfare experts in Berlin received detailed reports describing the morale impact of the new tactic, but their recommendations for countermeasures proved largely ineffective. Unlike traditional artillery, which could be suppressed through counter-battery fire or avoided through tactical movement, the Katyusha's psychological effects seemed to operate independently of its physical presence. The mere possibility that Soviet forces might employ close-range rocket fire was sufficient to disrupt German tactical planning and reduce the effectiveness of armored assaults. Field Marshal von Manstein's headquarters issued tactical bulletins warning about the new threat, but these warnings served primarily to spread awareness of the weapon's terrifying capabilities, rather than providing effective protection against its use. German tank crews found themselves torn between tactical requirements that demanded close coordination and psychological needs that urged maximum dispersion. The confident advance formations that had proven so effective during the early stages of the Russian campaign became sources of vulnerability when commanders worried about presenting concentrated targets for rocket attack. Training programs in Germany began to include sessions designed to prepare soldiers for the psychological impact of rocket bombardment, but simulation exercises proved inadequate preparation for the real experience. Veterans returning from the Eastern Front described the sound of approaching Katyusha rockets in terms that suggested profound psychological trauma, using language typically associated with supernatural horror rather than conventional military threats. Medical officers reported increasing incidents of combat fatigue and anxiety disorders among troops who had been exposed to rocket fire, symptoms that persisted long after the immediate danger had passed. The weapon's psychological impact seemed to operate through mechanisms that bypassed rational analysis, creating fear responses that could not be controlled through willpower or military discipline. Intelligence summaries reaching Hitler's headquarters painted an increasingly grim picture of German morale in sectors where Soviet rocket artillery operated according to the new tactics. The technological superiority that had given German forces such decisive advantages during the early war years was being neutralized by tactical innovations that transformed Soviet weaknesses into strengths. More disturbing still, the new tactics suggested that Soviet commanders were learning to think creatively about warfare, adapting their strategies to exploit German psychological vulnerabilities rather than simply trying to match German technical capabilities. The war that had begun with such confidence in German tactical and technological superiority was becoming a conflict where individual initiative and psychological insight could overcome traditional military advantages. By October 1942, the sound of Katyusha rockets had become synonymous with Soviet resistance and German vulnerability, a psychological symbol that transcended its military function to represent the changing nature of the entire Eastern Front campaign. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it tactical changes that amplified the psychological impact of Volkov's innovations. Snow and freezing temperatures reduced the effectiveness of German mechanized operations while providing concealment for Soviet rocket units operating close to the front lines. The distinctive launch signature that had made Katyusha batteries vulnerable to counterattack became less visible in winter conditions, allowing crews to maintain more aggressive positions without immediately compromising their survivability. Volkov's battery, now officially authorized to employ the tactics he had developed through unauthorized experimentation, achieved a legendary status among both Soviet and German forces. His mathematical approach to psychological warfare had evolved into a comprehensive tactical system that other commanders studied and adapted to their specific situations. The quiet mathematics teacher's son from Kostroma had become one of the most influential artillery officers on the Eastern Front, though his name remained unknown outside military circles. The German retreat from Stalingrad, which began in earnest during January 1943, was hastened by the psychological pressure of constant rocket bombardment that seemed to arrive without warning from impossibly close range. Tank crews that had once advanced with confidence now moved with hesitation, their commanders constantly scanning the horizon for the telltale flash of rocket ignition. The initiative that had carried German forces across Europe was slowly being eroded by fear of weapons that killed through terror as much as explosive force. Soviet commanders began to understand that warfare involved psychological as well as physical destruction, and that individual innovation could sometimes achieve strategic results that traditional tactics could not match. Intelligence reports from German prisoners revealed the extent to which Katyusha tactics had disrupted enemy morale and tactical planning. Experienced German officers described the rocket bombardments in terms that suggested profound psychological impact, using language that emphasized the weapon's effect on human consciousness rather than its military effectiveness. The mathematical precision with which Soviet artillery crews could predict and exploit these psychological vulnerabilities had transformed the balance of power on the Eastern Front in ways that few observers fully understood. Volkov's unauthorized decision on that September morning had initiated a cascade of tactical innovations that continued to influence military doctrine long after the immediate crisis had passed. By the spring of 1943, close-range Katyusha tactics had been incorporated into official Soviet artillery doctrine, with detailed manuals describing the mathematical relationships between range, psychological impact, and tactical effectiveness. Training programs now included specific instruction on exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities that traditional artillery doctrine had ignored. The weapon system that had been viewed with skepticism by conservative officers had become the foundation for tactical innovations that influenced every level of military planning. But the most profound changes occurred among the men who had witnessed the transformation of warfare from an exercise in mechanical precision to a contest of psychological endurance. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Volkov, promoted twice in recognition of his tactical innovations, stood in his post-war office at the Frunze Military Academy, reviewing after-action reports from artillery units throughout Eastern Europe. The mathematical principles he had discovered during that desperate morning outside Stalingrad had evolved into comprehensive tactical doctrine that influenced military planning throughout the Warsaw Pact. Students from dozens of countries studied the psychological applications of artillery fire, learning to calculate fear as precisely as they calculated trajectory and impact. The quiet blacksmith's son, who had questioned standard firing tables during his training, had become one of the most influential military theorists of his generation, though his innovations remained classified secrets known only to professional military audiences. German military academies, rebuilt during the post-war reconstruction, included detailed case studies of Katyusha tactics in their curriculum, teaching future officers to recognize and counter the psychological dimensions of modern warfare. Veterans of the Eastern Front contributed to these studies with testimonies that revealed the lasting psychological impact of weapons that operated through fear as well as destruction. The tactical principles that Volkov had discovered through unauthorized experimentation had become fundamental elements of modern military doctrine, influencing conflict strategies throughout the Cold War period and beyond. But perhaps the most significant legacy involved the broader understanding that individual initiative could sometimes achieve strategic results that institutional thinking could not match. The military hierarchies that had emphasized obedience and standardization learned to value creative thinking and tactical innovation. recognizing that future conflicts would reward adaptability over rigid adherence to established doctrine. Letters from German veterans preserved in military archives provided detailed descriptions of the psychological impact that Katyusha bombardments had achieved among troops who had considered themselves immune to fear. These testimonies revealed that the weapon's true effectiveness had operated through mechanisms that bypassed rational analysis, creating trauma responses that persisted long after the war had ended. Medical researchers studying combat fatigue and post-traumatic stress found that veterans who had experienced close-range rocket bombardment displayed symptoms that differed significantly from those caused by conventional artillery. The distinctive sound of the Katyusha launch had imprinted itself on human memory with traumatic intensity, creating associations that could be triggered decades after the original exposure. Volkov's mathematical insight into the relationship between sound, distance, and psychological impact had revealed fundamental truths about human consciousness that transcended military applications. His calculations had demonstrated that fear could be engineered with scientific precision, measured and predicted as accurately as any physical phenomenon. The unauthorized decision that had violated direct orders had ultimately contributed to strategic victory through tactical innovations that transformed the nature of modern warfare. The mathematics of terror that he had discovered during those desperate moments outside Stalingrad continued to influence military thinking throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The broader implications extended far beyond military doctrine into fundamental questions about authority, innovation, and the relationship between individual initiative and institutional control. Volkov's story became a case study in leadership schools throughout the Soviet Union, illustrating how creative thinking could overcome seemingly impossible challenges when applied with mathematical precision and moral courage. The tension between obedience and innovation that had characterized his decision remained a central theme in military education for decades after the war. Students learned to balance respect for authority with recognition that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. The psychological insights that had made his tactics so effective found applications in fields ranging from education to industrial management, wherever human motivation and performance could be influenced through systematic analysis of psychological factors. But the most enduring legacy involved the transformation of artillery from a mechanical discipline into a psychological science. The mathematical relationships that Volkov had identified between distance, sound, and fear became the foundation for acoustic warfare research that continued throughout the Cold War period. Military engineers designed new weapons specifically to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities that his experiments had revealed, creating systems that achieved strategic objectives through terror rather than destruction. The ethical implications of such weapons sparked debates that continued long after their military effectiveness had been demonstrated beyond question. Volkov himself remained ambivalent about these developments, proud of his technical innovations but troubled by their psychological applications. His post-war writings emphasized the defensive nature of his original tactics, designed to protect Soviet soldiers rather than terrorize enemy civilians. The mathematical principles that had saved his comrades outside Stalingrad had evolved into systematic methods for psychological manipulation that raised profound questions about the ethics of modern warfare. He spent his final years teaching artillery science to international students, emphasizing the human dimensions of military technology and the moral responsibilities that accompanied technical expertise. His lectures included detailed discussions of the psychological impact that weapons could achieve, but always within the context of defensive operations designed to protect rather than terrorize. The students who learned from him carried these lessons throughout the world, spreading understanding of both the technical capabilities and the ethical limitations that should govern the use of psychological warfare. His death in 1987 marked the end of an era in military thinking, but his intellectual legacy continued to influence tactical doctrine and strategic planning throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The mathematical insights that had begun with unauthorized disobedience to save Soviet infantry had evolved into comprehensive theories about the psychological dimensions of modern conflict, theories that shaped military planning during some of the most dangerous periods in human history. The ultimate irony lay in how completely his tactical innovations had achieved their original objective while creating consequences that extended far beyond his intentions or control. The German troops who had advanced so confidently across the wheat fields outside Stalingrad on that September morning in 1942 had experienced terror that transformed their understanding of Soviet capabilities and their own vulnerabilities. The mathematical precision with which one Soviet artillery officer had calculated fear and applied it as a weapon had fundamentally altered the psychological balance of the Eastern Front, contributing to strategic outcomes that influenced the entire course of World War II. But the methods that had saved Soviet soldiers also became tools for psychological manipulation that raised troubling questions about the ethics of modern warfare. The sound of those 16 rockets shrieking through the morning air had carried with it the seeds of tactical innovations that would influence military thinking for generations, creating both defensive capabilities that protected innocent lives and offensive weapons that could terrorize entire populations. The unauthorized decision that had violated direct orders in service of a greater good had demonstrated both the power and the responsibility that accompanied individual initiative in moments of crisis. Would you have broken the order that morning, knowing that obedience meant watching your comrades die, but disobedience might transform the nature of warfare itself? Would you have chosen mathematical certainty over institutional authority when the stakes included not just immediate survival, but the psychological foundations of future conflict? Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means when individual innovation confronts institutional thinking, and when the mathematics of fear become weapons that can save or terrorize with equal precision.